is on side, given that we have such an energetic UN envoy, and given that both sides in this war, both main sides, there are many other sides, are going to be exhausted, I feel that there's a chance.
That was Dr. Elizabeth Kendall, a Yemen expert at Oxford University. You're listening to Newshour from the BBC World Service. Still to come on the programme, we'll be reporting from the front line of a pretend war between NATO and an imaginary foe.
Marines are coming in on landing craft under fire, supported by helicopters, and in the distance, warships that have already fired salvos, jets flying overhead. This is NATO's biggest military exercise since the end of the Cold War.
More from those NATO war games coming up in just under 15 minutes' time. Our main headlines from the BBC Newsroom this hour. The US Attorney General Jeff Sessions has denounced what he says is a rapid increase in Chinese industrial espionage, saying enough is enough. And the anti-corruption judge responsible for jailing Brazil's former President Lula has been appointed by the country's far-right president-elect as his justice minister. This is James Menendez with Newshour, live from the BBC. To Sri Lanka now, and the biggest political crisis in this island nation since the end of the Civil War in 2009. Indeed, the link to those bloody final days of the conflict is the man who was president at the time, Mahinda Rajapaksa, and has just become the new Prime Minister. But amid great controversy because his predecessor and longtime rival Ranil Wickremesinghe is refusing to go quietly, saying that his sacking by the current president was unconstitutional. Parliament will be reconvened on Monday in an effort to break the deadlock. In the meantime, Mr. Wickremesinghe is also refusing to leave his official residence in the capital, Colombo. The BBC's Yogita Limai is there.
Mr. Wickremesinghe refuses to accept his removal. What he's basically saying is what the president did on Friday last week was unconstitutional. He says the president doesn't have the right to remove him. He can only be removed if he loses majority in parliament. And he wants parliament to be summoned immediately so that he gets a chance to prove that majority in the House. And he essentially says that if needed, there will be more protests. You'll remember that earlier this week on Tuesday, we saw mass protests. Earlier today as well, I was at a political protest. It was smaller, maybe hundreds of people.
Yogita, is he right that the president doesn't have the ability, the constitutional right to sack the prime minister?
Well, so James, I spoke to a constitutional expert yesterday, and he said that according to the Constitution as it is now, the President does not have the right to remove the Prime Minister. However, the President, in his address to the nation earlier this week, has very clearly stated that it is his belief and, the advice, the legal advice that he has got says that he's not done anything constitutionally invalid.
So what's gone wrong then? Is it a sort of personal fallout that these two men have had?
Well, in his address to the nation, Mr. Sirisena has certainly said that there were differences of opinion between him and the Prime Minister. He's accused the Prime Minister of taking individual decisions, not taking his cabinet and other people into confidence.
What are the regional implications? I'm thinking India, China. Where do they stand on all this?
At the moment, they've already requested that the president act in a manner sort of that is constitutional. This is something that has come from the European Union as well, has come from the US as well.
But what about these allegations that China may be pulling the strings, maybe giving money to Mahinda Rajapaksa to finance his prime ministership?
Well, it's very hard to sort of substantiate those allegations. What is definitely true is that, when Mahinda Rajapaksa was in government, he had a lot of dealings with the Chinese. There were a lot of projects in Sri Lanka, big projects that, have so far turned out to be white elephants. So a big airport that was built in Mahinda Rajapaksa's constituency in the south of Sri Lanka, as well as a big port. All of those were built with big Chinese loans. And it's come to a situation where they're caught in a debt trap with China. China, where they have loans they can't pay back. So, certainly the opposition, which is Ranil Wickremesinghe and his party members, are saying that, China may be supporting Mahinda Rajapaksa in his bid to come back because he was seen as the man who is close to the Chinese government. But it's very hard to substantiate those kinds of claims. What we also, certainly know is going on at this moment is hectic negotiations from both sides, because, James, this is a 225-member parliament, and whoever, has to win a majority has to have the support of 113 or more MPs. We've heard sort of several allegations from civil rights groups saying, there's lots of money on offer for anyone who wants to jump sides.
The BBC's Yogita Limai speaking to us from Colombo in Sri Lanka. Now to the first of two reports today ahead of the midterm elections in the US next week. Later we'll hear from Mississippi about the role of religion. First, though, we're going to head to Pennsylvania to talk about the economy, which remains buoyant. Today's figures from the US Treasury confirm the trend that productivity is up, jobless claims are down, and follow Labour Department figures this week, which show the biggest wage rises in a decade. That's making many Americans feel optimistic about their prospects. But perhaps not Democrats, who have been hoping for a so-called blue wave election that might act as a check on the Trump presidency. Justin Webb reports.
I've come to a suburban cul-de-sac, not far from Pittsburgh. You can hear a dog barking there because we have arrived at number 530, and I'm with Jason, who is an electrician. And Jason, what's brought you here?
So what we're doing today is we're going to do an underground splice on this lamppost. The dog actually dug it up and bit through the wire. So we've got the splice kit put on there right now. We're going to do a heat shrink on there to keep the water from getting in there. And it should keep the line good for at least another 30 years.
Tell me about how business is going.
It's booming. We went from 2 employees about 2 years ago. Now we're up to 6. Hoping over the next 18 months, we're going to be at 18 employees.
You're going from 2 to 18?
Yes. The influx of work is amazing. We were seeing people that were skipping safety items because they didn't want to spend the money. But now we see a lot more of luxury items, a lot of hot tubs going in. We do a lot of swimming pools now. I think the economic stability is what's really helping it. People just know that, we're out of the recession. If they lose their job, they can find another job.
Donald Trump's America is an America on the move, on the make. It's a blue-collar America, out all day, as they are in front of me here, flattening some land ready for building on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. On building sites like this, they are bringing home money at the end of the day. It's an America that feels as if it's working again.
I'm Sean.
I'm Jason.
Business is booming. Everyone's building around here. It's just like expanding.
It's just nonstop, just keeps on going.
And for people, obviously, you got a parts business for autos here. It really matters that people have got money in their pockets.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Is it the Trump economy?
I can't exactly answer that one, but it seems like it has started growing since he's been in office.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with him. The same thing. I mean, ever since he came in office, it's like booming up here. I mean, it's just like unreal. And then like the businesses, there's like auto parts opening up all over. I mean, we're not the only one. They're building a new one right next door to us. There's one right down the block, another one right down the other block.
So whatever you think of Trump,
yeah,
that side of his time in office has been good.
Yes, definitely.
The actions we took during the crisis turned the economy around, started the longest streak of job creation on record. So when you're here right now, folks, take credit for this economic miracle. It's like, hold on.
A familiar voice, also in Pennsylvania in recent days, arguing that the Trump economic claims are simply false. And most experts would accept that the fizzing local economy is not just down to this president. People here aren't stupid. Donald Trump doesn't fool them with his overblown claims, but at the same time they genuinely feel something stirring, as we heard from Jim Paff, who runs a local welding company.
If you can maintain the environment that we can work in and continue to work without encumbrance, then yeah, this whole Make America Great is going to be, it'll happen.
But he says what he's doing is exactly that, getting rid of regulations, reducing taxes. Are you feeling that?
For me, it's a little early in the game. We've had tax relief. That remains to be seen whether or not how big of an effect that has.
You're paying less tax now under Donald Trump than you were before.
Supposedly. I'll let you know at the end of the year.
A report from Pennsylvania by the BBC's Justin Webb. You're listening to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. Do stay with us. We've got a lot more coming up in the next half hour of the programme. Don't go away. Coming up next, President Trump on immigration and asylum policy. But first, NATO is holding its biggest military manoeuvres since the end of the Cold War, involving a mock invasion of Norway. Operation Trident Juncture started last week. It involves all 29 NATO members, as well as Finland and Sweden, and it's taking place a few hundred kilometres from Norway's border with Russia, as our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale now reports.
The sound of war has come to Norway. A picturesque field just outside Trondheim, the scene for a large show of force by NATO nations, rehearsing how they defend an ally that's been invaded. Marines are coming in on landing craft, under fire, supported by helicopters, and in the distance, warships that have already fired salvos, jets flying overhead. This is NATO's biggest military exercise since the end of the Cold War. This is just one of a series of assaults taking place right across the middle of Norway over the next few weeks, involving all 29 NATO members, as well as Finland and Sweden. They too have become concerned about the increase in Russian military activity in this region. But NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg still insists this is not a warning to anyone in particular.
This exercise is not directed against any specific country. It's a message to all potential adversaries that NATO has the resolve and the capabilities to defend all allies, and by doing so, we prevent a military attack.
NATO insists this is not a new Cold War, but they are relearning the military skills that they used during that era. Colonel Nov Nanovo is the deputy commander of NATO's logistics support group.
We're supporting a force of around about 50,000 troops, 10,000 vehicles, and those equipments and personnel have had to come from their parent nations here to Norway, and we've done that by bringing them in by sea, by rail, by land and by air, and then moving them to their final destinations to conduct their training. So that's taken about 5 weeks so far.
Russia is watching this exercise closely. Moscow recently announced it would be conducting its own naval exercises off the coast of Norway later this week. And those NATO members that border Russia are less equivocal about the need to send a direct message. Lieutenant General Andrzejczak is Poland's most senior military officer.
The performance of Russia, as I mentioned, is definitely the aggressive one. We observe, especially in Poland, the situation in Ukraine and the huge exercises, the Zapad and the last exercise in the far east. So that we have to be ready to send a message that we are effective.
A report from those NATO exercises in Norway by our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale. You're listening to NewsHour from the BBC. We're live in London. I'm James Menendez. In the past hour or so, President Trump's been making a major speech on immigration from the White House. He said he's finalising a plan in which migrants will have to present themselves at a port of entry to gain admission to the US. He talked about building tent cities to accommodate asylum claimants so they're not released into the community.
These policies lead to the release of illegal aliens into our communities after they've been apprehended. But we're not releasing anymore. Big change as of a couple of days ago. We're going to No longer release. We're going to catch. We're not going to release. They're going to stay with us until the deportation hearing or the asylum hearing takes place. So we're not releasing them into the community.
So what else did President Trump have to say? The BBC's Washington correspondent Anthony Zerka has been telling me more.
President Trump said that he's going to have an executive order detailing all of this, going into exactly what it all means within the next week, because some of the things he talked about, ending so-called catch and release, where people who have been detained, who are seeking asylum, are allowed to stay within the United States while their asylum claims are processed. We don't have any kind of idea of exactly how that's going to be spelled out. One of the things was when he tried to do this before, that resulted in these family separations where children were held at separate facilities, and that generated a considerable amount of controversy. As you mentioned, he said he's going to end processing asylum seekers who come over not through legal checkpoints. U.S. law says that asylum seekers should be granted asylum or heard for their asylum claims wherever they come across. So there's a question about the legality of that particular move. And then Donald Trump had a couple of assertions. He said there were 20 million undocumented migrants currently in the U.S. That number is actually reported to be around 12 million. He also said that very few asylum claims or claimants show up for their day in court. He said around 3%. The reality is that number is closer to 60 or 70%. And one other thing to note, this caravan that's coming up through the Mexican border, in the past, these caravans have presented themselves at legal checkpoints. So this change that Donald Trump has about granting asylum, that probably won't apply to them if they follow past precedent.
There's been a lot of talk about immigration, also talking about revoking birthright, citizenship, these sort of issues. I mean, what's prompted all this? I mean, is it simply the fact that we've got these midterms coming up?
I think you have to see this in terms, in the context of the upcoming midterms. I mean, these are very serious things that Donald Trump is proposing, and they should be taken seriously outside of the political context. But the reality is that this appears to be an attempt by Donald Trump to put the focus of American voters on the immigration issue. He views that as a political winner. He campaigned on it in 2016, and he did win. Right now, American voters are talking about other things. They're talking about the economy. They're talking about health care. They're talking about trade. Donald Trump wants everyone's focus to be on immigration, an area where he thinks he has significant authority to take action, and that the public is by and large on his side, although polls don't necessarily show that to be true.
Anthony Zerka talking to us from Washington. A little later in the program, we will be looking at what Christian voters in Mississippi make of President Trump's approach to immigration and other issues. As I say, a little later in the program in about 15 minutes' time. Now, today, staff at Google offices around the world staged an unprecedented series of walkouts in protest at the company's treatment of women. The employees are demanding several key changes in how sexual misconduct allegations are dealt with at the firm. So what's behind this? Well, resentment came to a head with revelations last week that a former Google executive, Andy Rubin, received a $90 million payout after he left, despite what Google considered a credible allegation of sexual misconduct against him. He denies the allegations. Google Chief Executive Sundar Pichai has told staff he supports their right to take the action. Google sent us a statement from him, which added, employees have raised constructive ideas for how we can improve our policies and our processes going forward. We are taking in all their feedback so we can turn these ideas into action. Well, Erica Anderson works for Google in New York, and she joined me a little earlier, and I began by asking her why she had joined the walkout there.
I took part in the walkout here in New York City really to walk out in solidarity with other Googlers and contractors to protest sexual harassment, misconduct, lack of transparency in a workplace culture that's just not working for everyone. And ultimately, what we want is accountability. We wanted to present these demands and really start a conversation with the executives about how to move this forward.
And just give us a sort of an example or two of what sort of changes you'd like to see happen in the future.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, we presented 5 demands to executives, and the first is an end to forced arbitration in cases of harassment and discrimination, along with a right for every Google worker to bring someone of their choosing when meeting with HR, especially when filing a harassment claim. In addition to that, the other demands included an end to pay inequity, a sexual harassment transparency report, a safe and inclusive reporting process for all employees to file sexual harassment, not just full-time employees, but also contractors, which make up a large portion of the Google workforce. And finally, a chief diversity officer who reports directly to the CEO.
Well, the forced arbitration that you mentioned, what's the problem with that?
Well, I'm not a legal expert, but I've definitely done a lot of research on this. And as I've learned, it is a standard practice. It's a legal tactic that companies use to settle disputes, whether it's sexual harassment, age discrimination, racial discrimination. And oftentimes it's a condition of employment. You know, when getting a job at a place like this, you sign an agreement, you agree to do a private arbitration if something happens. I think there's been a lot of documentation and research about why this isn't, oftentimes in the benefit of the victim or the person who's coming forward. And we've seen other companies remove this as a stipulation of employment, and we'd love to see Google do the same.
Is Google a bad place to work if you're a woman?
No, not at all. But this definitely shines a light on some of the changes that need to be made. I mean, listen, despite all this, Google is still an incredible place to work. The culture is not broken. In fact, the culture is working. But this is a turning point. You know, we want to have a continued discussion about this. We want to know that there's accountability when women do, or men, frankly, do report sexual harassment. That's going to be followed up on, and that action is going to be taken. I've had many conversations over the past few days with colleagues who have been afraid to report sexual harassment, or who have reported it and didn't get the kind of response that they had hoped or that they expected. So listen, Google wants to recruit and maintain, retain the top talent and have a more diverse culture. And we think this is a really important piece of that puzzle. So we're excited, and honestly, Sundar asked for ideas and we've delivered, and we look forward to meaningful change.
Erica Anderson, who joined the Google walkout today in New York. Now, West African waters are among the most abundant fishing grounds in the world, feeding and providing jobs for millions of people across the region. But catches are plummeting as most of their fish stocks have already been overfished, according to the UN. So who or what is to blame? The BBC's Alfonso Daniels gained rare access to Mauritania and also travelled to Senegal to find out.
Thousands of large wooden traditional fishing boats stand idle along the shore in Saint Louis, the oldest fishing community in Senegal. For generations, this place fed the nation, but it's now in danger.
It is a disaster. We don't have fish here. Every year, we get less and less fish. Everybody is aware that there is no fish in our waters.
Fisherman Moore Ndiaye is standing right on the beach as traditional boats unload their catch behind him. The species especially at risk is Sardinella, another so-called pelagic or open water fish which migrate up and down the West African coast, providing up to 75% of the animal protein consumed by people in the region.
The fish here go to other countries like Mali, like Burkina Faso, those countries. So
if the fisheries collapses here, that means that the effects will be felt throughout the region.
Of course, if there is no fish in Saint Louis, it's a disaster.
For generations, fishermen here have cast their nets in the rich waters of neighboring Mauritania, especially as the fish became scarce. But 2 years ago, the Mauritanians booted them out, causing catches to plummet by 80%. Still, Senegalese fishermen continue crossing illegally, even if that means risking their lives. Down the road, Fatou Ndiaye is cooking sardinella, her family's main meal today. She's keenly aware of sardinella's value and its human cost. Earlier this year, her eldest son, Falou, sailed northwards and was killed by the Mauritanian Coast Guard.
That day, my son left home around 7 p.m. and as his team approached the border with Mauritanian waters, they encountered a Mauritanian Coast Guard vessel. The Coast Guard opened fire on them. They shot 10 times, and the last bullet killed my Falou.
Falou's death sparked violence in Saint Louis as furious locals attacked Mauritanian shops and burned several buildings. Many other fishermen are believed to have been killed, but no one knows the exact figures. Meantime, other Senegalese crews have been arrested, their boats and equipment confiscated, leaving their families destitute.
Falou was my eldest son, and I have other offspring too because I'm divorced from Falou's father. Afterwards, I married another man who gave me 3 smaller children. But that man became ill and he died. Falou used to give the family all the money he earned to help us out. from the moment he started working to the day he died.
I'm very sorry. Mauritania says it's simply trying to protect its fisheries and create local jobs. But is this true? To find out, I traveled hundreds of kilometers through the desert to Nouadhibou, the country's only fishing port, and found a striking new industry. This is the sound of the fish industry in Mauritania today. Thousands of fish being turned into dust to create fish meal. Fish meal is a kind of powdered protein used for animal feed. And fish meal processing is growing exponentially here. There are some 20 fish meal plants in Nouadhibou alone, producing fish meal which is mainly exported to China to feed other fish and livestock. Almost half of the country's fisheries production now ends up in fish meal. This is a hungry industry too, with 5 kilos of fish required to produce just 1 kilo of fish meal. And the fish they use is sardinella, the same species other West African countries depend on for their survival. There are some 15 plants in Senegal as well, despite the lack of fish, including one in St. Louis. Meantime, Mauritania's traditional fishermen, those supposed to benefit from the government's policy to boot out the Senegalese, now appear to be at risk too. At the beach, I find fisherman Abdullahi Bari with rows of fish meal plants stretching at a distance behind him.
Before, a small boat passed 1 or 2 days in the sea, catching a big quantity. Now the situation is different. The big ship catch all. If this situation continue, the blue sea will turn black.
Report from West Africa by the BBC's Alfonso Daniels. And you can hear more on that story from Alfonso on our programme Assignment here on the BBC World Service. Available on air and also online. You're listening to Newshour. This is News Hour. Let's just remind you of our top story this hour. The UN's issued its starkest warning yet about the impact of the war in Yemen on children. The regional director for the UN's children's agency, Gert Capellari, told us the country had become crippled to such a degree it was now the worst place on earth to be a child.
The war since 2015, the current deepening economic crisis, but decades of underdevelopment have made of Yemen probably, James, the worst place to be a child.
And one other headline this hour, the US Attorney General Jeff Sessions has denounced what he says is a rapid increase in Chinese industrial espionage, saying enough is enough. This is James Menendez with Newshour live from the BBC. Now, our oceans are getting warmer because of climate change. That much we knew. But according to a new report, those seas have been absorbing much more heat than previously thought. And that could have grave consequences for the oceans themselves, as well as efforts to keep global temperature rises to within 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. Dr. Laura Splandis from Princeton University in the US and is the report's lead author. I began by asking her how much we've underestimated ocean temperatures.
Ocean warming has been estimated in the past using direct measurements of temperature in the ocean. And we know pretty well what the warming is for the past 10 years. But the question was really before that, in the past 25 years, and there was some uncertainty because we didn't have enough data at that time. And so our study was about finding a new way, a new approach to measure ocean warming that would infirm and confirm some of those previous estimates and give us confidence in the numbers. And so we find, based on our method, an ocean warming that is really at the top range of what has been estimated before, and it's about 60% higher than what has been used in the IPCC report to estimate the climate sensitivity, meaning how the Earth is sensitive to anthropogenic emissions.
What does this mean in terms of the way the Earth has been responding to global warming and the presence of those greenhouse gases?
So it means the ocean has warmed more than we thought, which means the Earth has warmed more than we thought. And that means the Earth is more sensitive to anthropogenic emissions than we thought. We know that the ocean is taking up a lot of warming. We know it's more than 90%. But then the question was really how much exactly? So we can get a sense of how sensitive the planet is to warming.
So what are the implications then in terms of the way we deal with climate change?
The 1.5 degree report from the IPCC that came out recently kind of gives us a way forward on how to, if we want to stay below 1.5 or 2 degrees, how we should respond. And basically what our study suggests is that because the ocean actually holds more heat than we thought, this is going to be harder. It's going to make it harder to get there, to stay below those targets.
Why is that?
Well, that's linked to the climate sensitivity of the Earth. The Earth is more sensitive to emissions than what we thought. So those scenarios, they tell you kind of what we expect the temperature to be in response to a certain level of emissions, to a certain amount of emissions. And now that we realize that the planet is more sensitive to those emissions, it means with the same amount of emission, we're going to actually have a higher temperature than what we thought.
If we're thinking about cutting emissions to keep temperature rises within those limits, we're going to have to cut much more.
Well, we're going to have to cut more, or at least it's going to be harder to get there. So if there was any easy way forward, it kind of closed the window for those easy way forward.
Presumably, the fact that the oceans are warmer than we thought, have absorbed more heat, that's going to have an impact on the oceans themselves.
Yes. So because the oceans are warmer, the organisms living in there have to cope with that warming. And also one of those implications, one of those impacts is that a warmer ocean holds less oxygen. It loses its oxygen to the atmosphere. And that's one other thing that the organisms will have to cope with. And many organisms need oxygen to breathe like we do.
I mean, it is still an estimate, isn't it? But how sure are you of your findings?
What makes us confident in those estimates is the fact that our estimate is really at the top range of another method. So now what we have is two different methods, two different approaches that give the same high value of ocean warming. One is direct measurements of in-situ temperature, in the ocean, and the other one is our method, which is completely independent and it's based on atmospheric gas composition.
So you're confident this is as accurate a picture that we have at the moment?
It's a robust picture, yes, I think.
That was Dr. Laure Resplondi from Princeton University in the United States. Back to the run-up to next week's midterm elections in the US. With just days to go, President Trump has been on the road again, rallying his base. Some of his most devoted followers include evangelical Christians. But some admit they struggle with Donald Trump's sometimes less than Christian language, as well as lurid claims about his personal life. Chris Buckler's also on the road ahead of those midterms. He's been to Mississippi to look at religion's influence on America's upcoming vote.
As you drive across the US, you'll hear that politics and religion are treated as part of the same conversation.
Welcome to today's issues. Join us for the next hour as we offer a Christian response to the issues of the day.
Christian talk radio stations don't shy away from controversial topics. In many cases, they seem to actually embrace them.
It feels like there's a church on almost every corner in Oxford, Mississippi. This is said to be the most religious state in the US, and that extends to Ole Miss, the university here that has a long list of active Christian societies. And while most of their members say they'll support the Republican Party in the midterm elections, there are subjects people struggle with, including one of President Trump's favorite topics, immigration.
The president's making a much bigger deal out of this caravan than it is. I think the word used as an invasion, I think, is overblown. And I do think as Christians we have a call to help people.
Kyle Brassel is the president of the Baptist Student Union here at Ole Miss. He is concerned about how Donald Trump has spoken about the caravan of migrants still weeks away from the US-Mexico border, but he'll still be voting Republican.
As a Christian, like you said, we are called to be welcoming of strangers. We're called to be taking care of those in need and those in danger. But I think there is a middle ground that Christians can stand on that says we want to help those in need, but that doesn't mean allowing every person into the United States.
In Galatians chapter 5.
In Bible study here, they talk about living a godly life. And another student, John Wilson, admits he struggles with the personal values of a president who's lied, has been accused of affairs and made payments to porn stars.
Desires what is against the flesh.
Yeah, I mean, it's all extremely troubling. The thing that conservatives are doing is celebrating the policy wins and kind of trying to push some of that other stuff under the rug.
Those kind of conversations are not unique to Mississippi. They're happening in churches in state after state, including in Eau Claire in Wisconsin. Pam Schultz is part of the congregation at the Calvary Baptist Church.
I believe that we need to respect our president.
Do you think he always represents the Christian values? Because obviously there are things that he has done that perhaps do not fit with Christian values.
I think that can probably be said of every politician. We're all sinners saved by grace. And so if he can recognize that and get advice from other people and, you know, and surround himself with wise people, then I would be comforted in that.
And that report from Mississippi by the BBC's Chris Buckler. That brings us to the end of this edition of Newshour from me and the rest of the team here in London. Until tomorrow, bye-bye.
Newshour has been a download from the BBC. To discover more and our terms of use, visit bbc.com/podcasts.
Is openly criticizing you. This outrage must not Presidente Tropico.
People of Tropico, I want to stress the great progress we have made. Production has increased steadily, exceeding 25% in some areas. I tell you, we will complete the 5-year plan in 4 years. This is progress. Yes, there are problems. There will always be problems, especially in the current economic situation. The bad health care, about which I hear so much these days, is one of them. And it will be resolved, as will all others, in time as the global economy stabilizes. Through the years of my presidency, I have received your gratitude, my compañeros. Alas, I am nothing but a humble servant, and you are my masters, my employers. I, in turn, want to show my gratitude to the brave defenders of Tropico and all militarists. The development in the past years is obvious to all. Still, there are lots of things to be done. As part of my reform plan for my next mandate, I shall see to it that our brave army has enough officers. Our minds are cold, our hearts are hot, our victory secure.
My dear President. Presidente, this congratulations. President, the U.S. Senate. Why don't you try Presidente cereal? Completely organic for people like you, Sonny. It's made from stuff that even animals won't eat.
No cereal can be organic enough. The Presidente brand doing okay then?
Sure. Presidente's so popular, everything with his name sells.
My son, I had a serious chat with the big boss today. He does not agree. Presidente, the international markets have collapsed. The Western media call this the collapse of communism. Presidente, Mayor. Presidente, the secret. Venerable leader, Samayi Comrade, the revolution is ready to... Dear Tropicans, I want to remind you all that you must start crying at precisely 10 a.m. tomorrow for Presidente's funeral rehearsal.
The official contest for the best display of grief starts at 10:15 and ends at 11. The rest of the day will be committed to reading eulogies for El Presidente.
Presidente, the international markets are rising again. The Western media say that the free market has saved.
My son, I spoke to God today, and he is not very pleased right now. He wants some things signed.
Comrade, I have a secret task for you. It is a matter of international urgency.
Our society is relying too much on simple resource gathering, Presidente. It is time to introduce industry and tourism to
Great concern has seized me as I watch how the rest of Tropico more urgently demands.
Presidente, our weathermen report that an enemy tornado is going to invade our island.
Dear listeners, if you see a flying cow go past your window, you may not be as drunk as you think. A twister is carving a path of destruction through our island, lifting livestock, cars, and even small buildings in the air.
Truly, the destructive power of Mother Nature can humble any of us.
Except El Presidente, who humbles Mother Nature instead.
The tornado retreated, Presidente.
Presidente, Tropico.
Citizens of Tropico, the importance of the upcoming elections has brought me before you. We are one step closer to our goals. Victory is almost upon us, but we must still push forward. Housing is insufficient.
Foreign leader, the mighty Chinese dragon is hungry for your goods.
foreign leader.
And now, an exclusive interview with El Presidente's childhood bear, which is now on display at his childhood museum. Misha, how do you feel about being on display? Oh, it's great. Come and see us all.
Aren't you a little old to be playing with dolls?
Don't listen to the snarky lady, Misha.
Snarky?
My dear Presidente, the election day draws near. Presidente, the intellectuals are saying that our Minister of Education Presidente, our sources indicate that not a single faction in Tropico despises you enough to make trouble.
My friend, I know I promised you my second best camel as a gift, but I would be proud to die in a modern communist Tropican hospital.
Lots of interesting things happened today. A two-headed llama was born. My nephew swallowed a coin. Oh yes, and our leader just hit 20 years in office.
Hello and welcome to Newshour from the BBC World Service. We're coming to you live from London. I'm James Menendez. Today we'll be hearing from women protesting against sexual misconduct at Google, why the oceans have warmed much more than we thought, and the implications of that for the future. We'll also have reports from Pennsylvania and Mississippi ahead of next week's US midterm elections. But we start today in Yemen, in a war that's already killed thousands of people and threatens the lives of many, many more through famine and disease. We heard on Wednesday those calls from the US for a prompt ceasefire and a return to negotiations in the next few weeks. Well, today, another reminder why progress towards ending the conflict is so urgent. A warning from the UN Children's Agency UNICEF that nearly 2 million Yemeni children under the age of 5 are facing acute malnutrition. 7 million children are at serious risk of famine. I've been speaking to UNICEF's regional director, Kher Kapalari, who's in Yemen in the port of Hodeidah, the main entry point for aid and indeed all supplies, which is why it's also a flashpoint in the war. What has he been seeing?
First and foremost, a heap of misery amongst millions of children throughout Yemen. The war since 2015, the current deepening economic crisis, but decades of underdevelopment have made of Yemen probably, James, the worst place to be a child. It is really heartbreaking to see this morning here in the hospitals in Hodeidah, numbers and numbers of severely acute malnourished children. It is heartbreaking to see most of the children here in Hodeidah not in school. The children who are suffering from diphtheria. I saw several young girls this morning in the hospital paralyzed because of diphtheria. Diphtheria, an illness, James, that can be easily prevented if children get timely vaccination.
It's a very, very bleak picture indeed that you paint. What help is getting through? What help are you able to provide at this point?
UNICEF is today active in every single of the 333 districts throughout the country. We are providing day and night assistance in order to address the problem of malnutrition, in order to respond to the cholera crisis by providing the oral rehydration therapy for the children. We try as much as possible to keep schools going. And one of the measures that is contributing to that is our emergency cash transfer. We are currently, as UNICEF, disbursing an emergency cash to the 1.5 million most vulnerable families in Yemen, giving them a very small amount of money every month, but a small amount that makes a world of difference for the children and for their families. We do all of this in very, very difficult circumstances with all parties rather than facilitating the delivery of humanitarian assistance, all parties on very regular basis, obstructing, in fact, the help that the assistance is reaching the children. The port of Hodeida should be Yemen's lifeline, but then the very few supplies, James, we are able to bring in are then stuck for several weeks because of bureaucratic hurdles that continue to be imposed. So I have found at the port, on trucks loaded, medicines that could help children a couple of kilometers further away who are dying in the hospital.
It's not just bureaucracy, is it? I mean, there is a war going on. How worried are you that if the fighting escalates in Hodeida, that could limit even further the supply of humanitarian aid? And what might that lead to, do you think?
Cutting off supplies from Hodeida port would mean that we would not be in a position anymore to provide those this minimum assistance to 70 to 80% of the population. So it would have truly devastating consequences for a population that finds itself already in one of the most dire circumstances that at least I have seen in my humanitarian career.
UNICEF's Geert Capellari. Well, Yemen's conflict is complex with many different warring factions, including separatists and Al-Qaeda. But any talks are likely to focus on the Saudi-led coalition that's fighting to restore the internationally recognized government of President Hadi, and the Houthi rebels aligned with Iran that forced him from power. We don't often hear from the Houthis, but our correspondent Orla Guerin has been talking to one of their leaders, Mohammed al-Houthi, in Sana'a, who told her that if Saudi atrocities in Yemen got as much attention as the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, Yemen would be in a very different situation today.
Going walkabout in Sana'a with Yemen's Houthi leadership. They gave us a guided tour of the ancient city, passing tributes to fighters killed in battle. After more than 3 years of war, the Houthis still have a firm grip on the capital. This senior rebel leader, Mohammed al-Houthi, keen to show he's a man of the people who won't hide from the Saudi-led coalition.
Do you expect that the Saudis will try and target you at some point with an airstrike?
They've tried many times, but they've not succeeded. What matters is the Yemeni people, not us. We aren't worried.
When we sat down, he said the Saudis had shown the world what Yemenis already know with the brutal killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
They just unveiled the face that was already obvious to the Yemeni people. The Yemeni people suffer executions and cover-ups. If there was as much coverage for the Yemeni people as there was for Jamal Khashoggi, and if there was coverage of the crimes committed here by the Saudis and the Americans, then Yemen would be in a different situation today.
How do you respond to the allegations that you are guilty of human rights abuses yourselves, that it's not only the Saudis who are guilty of these things?
Independent committees should investigate all these crimes, whether by us or the coalition. They are the only ones who can produce true and accurate information.
I myself have met people here who have told me they were victims of Houthi shelling and of Houthi landmines. What would you say to those people?
We do not deliberately harm civilians, but if they prove to investigating committees that we have harmed them, we are ready to compensate them.
For the war-weary of Yemen, a new threat is looming: starvation. The United Nations has warned that within months, 12 million innocent civilians could fall victim to a man-made famine. The Houthis blame a Saudi blockade. And they say Britain has blood on its hands because it continues to supply arms to the Saudis.
The UK is hugely responsible because of its arms sales. The British people should know that these weapons are being used by Saudis who are fighting for sectarian and extremist reasons. They're being used by crazy people who strike everywhere, breaching humanitarian law.
The conflict has become a quagmire, and there's no sign of a military victory on the horizon. The US is pushing for a ceasefire and a return to peace talks, but it's unclear if either side is ready to compromise.
Olagirin reporting. So what exactly do the Houthis want, and what are the prospects for peace talks? Questions for Yemen expert Dr. Elizabeth Kendall of Oxford University.
At the beginning of this war in 2015, what they wanted really was power without responsibility. They weren't able to get that. They've actually found themselves with the reins of power, and they have not done a great job of governing since then. What they want now probably is a way out of this, but a way in which they can still retain honour, in which they can claim some kind of success to their constituents who've put up with it for the last 3.5 years. But I don't think ultimately they want to govern Yemen.
So what needs to happen if these talks are going to get started?
Well, what needs to happen first is what we've already got, which is significant United States pressure to bring the warring parties to the table and an ultimatum, 30 days. We also need to have some very smart negotiations going on in the background. I'm sure that's happening with the UN envoy Martin Griffiths, but we want to avoid a repeat of what happened in September when the Geneva talks were stillborn because the Houthis did not turn up. There needs to be now a real will on both sides with all the little details hammered out in advance so that the talks can actually go ahead without anyone losing face again.
Is it more likely that the Houthis will turn up this time? I mean, what sort of assurances are they going to be looking for?
I imagine they'll be looking for the same kinds of assurances as previously, but more specifically, an assurance that they will be allowed to return to Yemen after the talks. That was one of their last-minute demands in September for the Geneva talks. And indeed, it wasn't so unreasonable of them, because after the 2016 talks in Kuwait failed, they were prevented from returning into Yemen for 3 months. So I imagine that that kind of detail is being discussed and ironed out in the background.
Do you think the Saudi-led coalition is also looking for a way out of this conflict now?
I imagine that it is, but a way out which enables it to declare victory. Look at it from a Saudi perspective. None of its war aims are being delivered. It's tried to prevent Yemen from fragmenting. It's failed. Yemen is fragmenting. It's tried to contain the influence of Iran. It's failed. Iranian influence is increasing. It's tried to restore the government of so-called legitimate President Hadi. It's failed. He's not even inside Yemen. And at the same time, it's financially crippling for Saudi Arabia and reputationally disastrous. So I imagine that Saudi would dearly like to find a way out.
Does that mean you're feeling more optimistic at this stage than perhaps in previous months?
I always try to be a little optimistic. I think that this time, given the lessons that will have been learned from the failed September talks, given that the US is on side, given that we have such an energetic UN envoy, and given that both sides in this war, both main sides, there are many other sides, are going to be exhausted, I feel that there's a chance.
And that was Dr. Elizabeth Kendall, Yemen expert at Oxford University. You're listening to Newshour from the BBC World Service. And still to come on the programme, we'll report from the front line of a pretend war between NATO and an imaginary foe.
Marines are coming in on landing craft under fire, supported by helicopters, and in the distance, warships that have already fired salvos, jets flying overhead. This is NATO's biggest military exercise since the end of the Cold War. More
from those major NATO war games coming up in just under 15 minutes' time. Our main headlines from the BBC Newsroom this hour. The US Attorney General Jeff Sessions has denounced what he says is a rapid increase in Chinese industrial espionage, saying enough is enough. And the anti-corruption judge responsible for jailing Brazil's former President Lula has been appointed by the country's far-right president-elect as his justice minister. This is James Menendez with Newshour live from the BBC. To Sri Lanka now, and the biggest political crisis in this island nation since the end of the civil war in 2009. Indeed, the link to those bloody final days of the conflict is the man who was president at the time, Mahinda Rajapaksa, and has just become the new prime minister. But amid a great controversy because his predecessor and longtime rival, Ranil Wickremesinghe, is refusing to go quietly, saying that his sacking by the current president was unconstitutional. Parliament will be reconvened on Monday in an effort to break the deadlock. In the meantime, Mr Wickremesinghe is also refusing to leave his official residence in the capital, Colombo. The BBC's Yogita Limai is there.
Mr. Wickremesinghe refuses to accept his removal. What he's basically saying is what the president did on Friday last week was unconstitutional. He says the president doesn't have the right to remove him. He can only be removed if he loses majority in parliament. And he wants parliament to be summoned immediately so that he gets a chance to prove that majority in the House. And he essentially says that if needed, there will be more protests. You'll remember that earlier this week on Tuesday, we saw mass protests. Earlier today as well, I was at a political protest which was smaller, maybe hundreds of people.
Yogita, is he right that the president doesn't have the ability, the constitutional right to sack the prime minister?
Well, so James, I spoke to a constitutional expert yesterday, and he said that according to the Constitution as it is now, the President does not have the right to remove the Prime Minister. However, the President, in his address to the nation earlier this week, has very clearly stated that it is his belief and, the advice, the legal advice that he has got says that he's not done anything constitutionally invalid.
So what's gone wrong then? Is it a sort of personal fallout that these two men have had?
Well, in his address to the nation, Mr. Sirisena has certainly said that there were differences of opinion between him and the Prime Minister. He's accused the Prime Minister of taking individual decisions, not taking his cabinet and other people into confidence.
What are the regional implications? I'm thinking India, China. Where do they stand on all this?
At the moment, they've already requested that the president act in a manner sort of that is constitutional. This is something that has come from the European Union as well, has come from the US as well.
But what about these allegations that China may be pulling the strings, maybe giving money to Mahinda Rajapaksa to finance his prime ministership?
Well, it's very hard to sort of substantiate those allegations. What is definitely true is that, when Mahinda Rajapaksa was in government, he had a lot of dealings with the Chinese. There were a lot of projects in Sri Lanka, big projects that, have so far turned out to be white elephants. So a big airport that was built in Mahinda Rajapaksa's constituency in the south of Sri Lanka, as well as a big port. All of those were built with big Chinese loans. And it's come to a situation where they're caught in a debt trap with China, where they have loans they can't pay back. So, certainly the opposition, which is Ranil Wickremesinghe and his party members, are saying that, China may be supporting Mahinda Rajapaksa in his bid to come back because he was seen as the man who is close to the Chinese government. But it's very hard to substantiate those kinds of claims. What we also, certainly know is going on at this moment is hectic negotiations from both sides because, James, this is a 225-member parliament and whoever, has to win a majority has to have the support of 113 or more MPs. We've heard sort of several allegations from civil rights groups saying, there's lots of money on offer for anyone who wants to jump sides.
And that was the BBC's Yogita Limai speaking to me from Colombo in Sri Lanka. Now to the first of two reports today ahead of the midterm elections in the US next week. Later we'll hear from Mississippi about the role of religion. But first we're going to head to Pennsylvania to talk about the economy, which remains buoyant. Today's figures from the US Treasury confirm the trend that productivity is up, jobless claims are down, and follow Labour Department figures this week, which showed the biggest wage rises in a decade. That's making many Americans feel optimistic about their prospects. but perhaps not Democrats, who have been hoping for a so-called blue wave election that might act as a check on the Trump presidency. Justin Webb reports.
I've come to a suburban cul-de-sac, not far from Pittsburgh. You can hear a dog barking there because we have arrived at number 530, and I'm with Jason, who is an electrician. And Jason, what's brought you here?
So what we're doing today is we're going to do an underground splice on this lamppost. The dog actually dug it up and bit through the wire. So we've got the splice kit put on there. Right now we're going to do a heat shrink on there to keep the water from getting in there. And it should keep the line good for at least another 30 years.
Tell me about how business is going.
It's booming. We went from 2 employees about 2 years ago. Now we're up to 6. Hoping over the next 18 months, we're going to be at 18 employees.
You're going from 2 to 18?
Yes. The influx of work is amazing. We were seeing people that were skipping safety items because they didn't want to spend the money. But now we see a lot more of luxury items, a lot of hot tubs going in. We do a lot of swimming pools now. I think the economic stability is what's really helping it. People just know that, we're out of the recession. If they lose their job, they can find another job.
Donald Trump's America is an America on the move, on the make. It's a blue-collar America.